This past week, I was out in Arizona taking a workshop that focused solely on painting flowers, and one question that came up had to do with palette. The master artist who was teaching the class advocated trying a limited palette, that is, one with red, yellow, blue, and white only, and he said that he often used a limited palette himself. Meanwhile, for the class he was teaching, he had a robust palette with a ton of colors. So, how do you know when to choose which palette? And how many colors should you really have? How do you know when it's time to expand the palette versus when you should rein it in? I've talked about the question of building a palette in a previous video that I'll link up above, but today I wanted to take the opportunity to expand on this topic. To start, I'd like to talk a bit about limited palettes and when you should consider using one. For context, limited palettes usually have 2 or 3 colors plus white. Some common limited palettes I've heard of are the following. The first is a basic warm and cool palette. So an example of that would probably be burnt umber or another dark earth color, plus ultramarine blue and titanium white. This palette is awesome for artists who are on the go and really just want enough paint to get the job done. Scott Burdick painted this piece and is known for his beautiful travel paintings. In his case, a lot of the time he has to pack light, so he'll just bring 3 tubes for studies on location and then use a more robust palette when he's back home in his studio. A warm, cool palette is also a common choice for painters doing cast paintings or other academic work as a way to explore color temperature without getting bogged down by a busy palette. Next up are primary palettes. First up, an example of this would be permanent magenta, cadmium yellow pale, ultramarine blue, and titanium white. Please note that you can substitute Cadred and for the magenta, or yellow ochre for the cad yellow pale, and I'll explain why in just a minute. You might be wondering why I didn't mention alizarin crimson for this palette. The reason is that regular alizarin crimson is not light fast, so if exposed to sunlight, it'll eventually become transparent to the point of being invisible. Nowadays, you can get permanent alizarin, but it's really just a less chromatic version of permanent magenta. So I've opted to go ahead and use the more chromatic alternative because I can always mix something that looks like alizarin. But as you'll note in my previous video, I cannot mix something that looks like permanent magenta. I can get pretty close, but it's always going to be disappointing. This means that permanent magenta is actually the closest color to a true primary red that's actually on my palette. Allow me to explain. So the next question after alizarin might have been, what about cad red? The truth is that we've been conditioned to think of primary colors slightly incorrectly. Typically, we think of the primary map as looking like this. It has a royal blue and a fire engine red and a pretty middle of the road yellow. A more accurate primary map, however, would look like this. And if this seems familiar, it's because it's how a printer works. Notice here that the mixing of equal parts yellow and magenta equals what we tend to think of as red and looks a whole lot like cadmium red. You'll also notice that these colors are a lot more vibrant than the ones on the traditional primary chart. Notice when I put these two next to one another, how the blended colors look. This means that this little known alternate primary chart is actually a lot more chromatic and thus has a lot more mixing power than what we typically think of as primary colors, which is all the more reason to opt for colors like these. Finally, I want to touch on yellow ochre. It's a pretty common color in a primary palette, And sometimes it is beneficial if you don't have any blaring yellow items in your painting and want to opt for something that feels a little bit more subdued and natural. Yellow ochre here can help you solidify your color harmony, as you can see in this example by Daniel Keyes. This can be another reason why you might opt for cadmium red instead of the slightly more vibrant permanent magenta. At the end of the day, though, any variation on a primary palette is an excellent compromise between achieving lightweight palette and having the range to mix just about any color you might need. Finally, I want to discuss one last variation on the primary palette, which is the Zorn palette. The thing that makes the Zorn palette unique is that rather than having your typical red, yellow, blue, and black, the Zorn palette actually substitutes ivory black in for blue because it tends to behave the same way when you're mixing it as paint. You may not be able to get intense blues with this palette, but just look at Zorn's work if you have any doubts as to what you can get done without ultramarine. Just to recap, that Zorn palette is typically considered cadmium red, yellow ochre, ivory black, and white. All right, with all of those visuals out of the way, let's go ahead and jump back into the painting, and then I'll go ahead and talk about the advantages of a limited palette, and then jump over to the advantages of a more robust palette. Aside from being lightweight, in general, a limited palette really makes you master color mixing. And the more limited your palette, the more likely you are to come away with a really strong color harmony in your painting. That is, all the colors will work together to create a cohesive, pleasing color composition. On the other hand, having too many bright colors from a larger palette can make this exceedingly difficult. By the way, I can't go too far into color harmony in this video simply because I don't have enough painting footage to make it fit, but comment down below and give this video a like if you'd like to see an upcoming video tackle color harmony in depth. Alright, so what about an expansive palette? In short, the two primary advantages of a larger palette are one, that you can mix a larger range of vibrant colors, and two, you have more room for convenience colors, which could make the painting process itself a bit quicker and easier. So when does this make sense? I wanted to talk about this with this particular painting because of the very bright tulips that I have in this composition. In this case, permanent magenta, ultramarine blue, cad red, cad orange, and cad yellow all came into play, in addition to the convenience of viridian for all of the greens you see here. I simply couldn't have made the bulbs as vibrant here without all of those colors, and having viridian helped the painting move along that much more quickly. In my experience, though, one of the only things in nature that truly necessitates such a robust palette is a bunch of flowers, or maybe a bunch of really bright man-made objects. Even landscapes with flowers in them often have a lot of atmospheric perspective or optical blending that softens the saturation and thus becomes a better fit for a less chromatic palette. So where does this leave you? Well, I will say this. I built my palette from Daniel Keyes' palette, who built his palette from Richard Schmid. So the first thing that I'll say is that if you have a particular subject matter that you really want to paint, and you have an artist who works in that style and subject whom you really want to emulate, starting with their palette and really learning why they use every color in it can be a really big help. In my case, I was really drawn to Daniel Keyes' use of color. I wasn't a floral painter necessarily, but I just thought his paintings were so vivid that I very specifically wanted to understand his palette and also his method of mark making. But if you don't have a convenient guide like that, my suggestion would be to first start with a limited palette and see where you get stuck. See what chromatic colors you just aren't capable of mixing because your palette isn't capable of that intensity. Then add new pigments one by one, learning the ins and outs of how each pigment mixes with all of the others. You may also want to just keep sight of how your color harmonies change as you add these new pigments in. If suddenly your compositions are feeling a little garish, it might be time to at least evaluate that addition and see if you can't rein it in to come back to color harmonies that please you a little bit more. And when in doubt, my rule of thumb would be absolutely make sure that you're checking the permanence and light fastness of any color that you decide to add. You definitely want to make sure that any paint that you put on your paintings is going to stand the test of time. And second, while this is a little bit less of a hard and fast rule than permanence, try and use quality paint wherever you can. Sometimes student grade paint can be great, but others you just wind up having to use so much more of it, and you can really have issues with muddy paintings. Aside from that, when you're at the point where you just don't have any difficulties matching the color that you're trying to create, that's probably when your palette is at a great point. I know this video went by pretty quickly, so if you have more questions on building a palette, make sure to go watch my previous palette video linked up above and then comment down below with your question. I know color theory is really intense and there's a lot of terminology that artists, myself included, can take for granted, so I'm happy to help and I'd love to hear what you'd like to better understand so that I can put it in an upcoming video for you. If you're interested in purchasing this painting, I've included a link in the description, and I've also put all of the materials I used for this painting, including the palette, brushes, and varnish, in the description box below. And as always, thank you for watching. I hope you learned something really helpful today, and I hope you have an excellent week of painting.